In this video, I'm going to start talking about alternative decision rules. So far we have talked about the MPV decision rule, but in this video I'm going to talk about the payback rule. I also will explain why it's not beneficial to use payback rule as an investment decision making tool. Okay, uh, this graph here shows the result of a survey by Graham and Harvey in 2001. This graph shows the most popular decision rule that is used by chief financial officers in US companies. So as you can see, there are other decision rules. Uh, for example, IRR is more popular than the MPV rule, and then we also have another decision rule, which is the payback rule. So the important thing here is to remember that we are going to always base our decision on the MPV rule. MPV rule is our golden rule, and we are always going to stick with the MPV rule. Okay, so if other decision rules give us a decision that disagree with the MPV rule, we are only going to follow the MPV rule. So if the MPV rule is the most important rule, why we need to know about the other rules? The reason is that you may encounter people that use these decision rules in a company that you're going to work for. So you should know about these investment decision rules and how you can imply them and how you can apply them. Okay, so in the next slide, I'm going to talk about the payback rule. So the payback rule is the simplest investment decision rule. The intuition behind this rule is that how fast a project can pay our initial investment back. So, for example, we have invested $100 million in a project. We want to know how many years will it take for a project to pay us back. In other words, the payback rule says we should only accept a project if its cash flows pay back its initial investment within a pre-specified period of time. Okay. So how can we apply this payback rule? First of all, we need to calculate the amount of time it takes to pay back the initial investment. This amount of time is called payback period. So let's say, as I said, let's say at time zero, we have $100 million investment, and then we have at time one and time two, we have let's say a $30 million, then a $50 million cash flow, and then at time three we have another 20 million in cash flows. Then at time four we also have 60 million cash flows. So for the payback rule, we have to calculate or add up these cash flows to see when we are going to pay back or when it will be equal to the our initial investment. So our initial investment was 100. So I'm going to add these cash flow until they become equal to these 100. So our pair our payback period is not 1 year because in the first year we are only getting $30 million. So it's also not 2 year because if I add 30 plus 50, it's 80. And so our payback period is not 2 year. But if I add up 30 plus 50 plus 20, this will be 100, and our payback period is 3 years. Okay, so once we calculate this payback period, we need to compare it with a pre-specified length of time that was set by either the CEO or CFO of a company. So once we calculate this payback period, we are going to accept the project if the payback period is less than a pre-specified length of time. So here I calculate it as 3 years. If the pre-specified length of time was 2 years, I'm going to accept. But uh, if the pre-specified length of time was 4 years, I'm going to reject. Okay, so this is reject and this is accept. So now let's solve an example to see how is that going to work. Suppose that the project need 81.6 million initial investment. This is the same example as we had in the MPV video. So this project will generate 28 million in cash flows for 4 years, starting from year one. Okay, so first I'm going to draw a timeline to show those cash flows. So this is at time zero, our initial investment is 81.6 million. At time one, we have 28. At time two, we have 28 million. At time three, we have another 28 million. And at time four, we have another $28 million in cash flows. Okay, so first of all, I am going to calculate the payback period. So I'm going to add these things until it's either equal or larger than 81.6. So our payback period is not one clearly, and if I add 28 plus 28, it's 56. So our payback period is not 2. So I need to add another 28. So if I add these things up, let's see, it's 84. So since 84 is larger than 81, so our payback period is 3 years. So this is one part of our answer, and then the question says, assume that the firm requires all projects to have a payback period of 2 years. So the payback period or the pre-specified length of time is 2 years. Since this 2 year is less than the payback period that we calculate for our project, we are going to reject this investment. Okay, so here again, I have wrote the same thing. It might be more clear in this slide. So since it takes 3 years to pay back the initial investment, we are going to reject this project using the payback rule. If you remember from our MPV video, we accepted this project because it has a positive MPV. So in reality, we need to stick with the MPV rule. But For this example, the answer would be rejecting the project based on the payback rule. Okay. So let's talk about the disadvantages of the payback rule. The payback rule has at least three problems or weaknesses. First of all, it ignores the time value of money. Second, it ignores cash flows after the payback period. So, if you remember when we were calculating the payback period, so time one, two, three, and four, we have $28 million in cash flows. So, once we calculate the payback period, we didn't really care about what is happening after the third year because our payback period was 3 years. So this investment decision making tool is ignoring any cash flows that is happening after the payback period. So, but here some project they might have very large cash flows after several years. And lastly, the number of years a firm choose for payback rule is arbitrary, it's random. There is no economic theory to support any kind of year. The decision to select a number of years for the period is purely random. So we cannot base our investment decision based on the payback rule. Okay. So this is the last slide that I'm going to talk about in this video. So some folks have come up with a discounted payback rule. So this discounted payback rule is going to account for the time value of money. But it could not solve the other two problems, which is those are first of all the number of payback period is random, and also the payback rule ignores any cash flows happening after the pre-specified period of time or pre-specified length of time by the firm. So because of those two weaknesses, still this discounted payback rule is not a reliable rule. So the question here is that if this decision rules, such as the payback rule and discounted payback rule, are not appropriate decision making tools, why some firms still use them? So the answer is that this is a very simple technique. Maybe for some small investments, the time and cost of doing a thorough MPV calculation is large, so the companies prefer to use a simpler technique such as payback period. Or in some very small companies, they might not have financial experts to calculate MPV, so they are going to base their decision on some arbitrary rules such as payback rule.